Thank you all for joining. My name is Julia Citron and I'm the Head of Professional Development at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation tonight. It's a 1-hour conversation about project-based learning and how we can apply digital tech to human-centered learning. This is the third event that DEFI has run. It's sponsored by ARM. Thank you, ARM. And for anyone who's not familiar with DEFI's work, they're an institute within the University of Cambridge, and their focus is on creatively exploring the possibilities that digital technology opens up for education. And a really big part of that, of course, is bringing together and connecting people who've got very different experiences and ideas and questions, and that's exactly what we're doing tonight. So that's why I'm particularly happy to see that joining our conversation, we've got university professors, we've got teachers, we've got curriculum designers, we've got heads of edtech NGOs, we've got people from all different perspectives, all coming to talk and share their experiences and questions and reflections on project-based learning. The events take place on Thursdays and they take place every month. Please do check out the website for more details of the next one. Thank you to everyone who agreed to have their details shared with the other participants. That's going to be available in the chat box to download. So feel free throughout this hour, throughout this conversation, to be messaging the other participants using the private chat functionality. Or if you've got a reflection you want to share with everyone, you can put that in the chat box. And importantly, if you've got a question you want to ask our fantastic panelists, put that in the Q&A box and we'll try and get round to it. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists for today. First off, joining us from Cambridgeshire, from the Fens in the UK, is Rob Leeman. Hi, Rob.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. And Rob is the Educational Solutions Manager for ARM, and he leads all of their outreach work with schools and in the education space. Great to have you here. We're also joined by Chanel from near Atlanta in Georgia. Hi, Chanel.
Hello.
And Chanel is a distinguished educator with loads of experience in middle school and primary STEM. She's currently the K-5 science lead for one of the biggest school districts in Georgia, as well as being the vice president of the Georgia Science Teachers Association. Great to have you with us. And finally, we've got Dr. Mark Miller, who is a lecturer at Northeastern University in California. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. And he is also the founder and executive director of a not-for-profit organization called Learning Tech that is helping schools and non-formal learning organizations, libraries, charities, all sorts of organizations to use technology better for learning. And that could be anything from helping them to write their digital strategy through to running PD or hands-on sessions. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. The first half of the session is going to be an introduction from our 3 panelists and some of their top line thoughts on project-based learning. And the second half of this session is going to be questions from yourself. So please use the chat box to share your reflections, to chat with each other and to ask us questions. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rob.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. So welcome everybody to my talk on project-based learning. I'm just going to start very, very quickly by just introducing myself in a little bit more detail. So I currently work as the Education Solutions Manager, as I was introduced. I've also previously worked at Cambridge Assessment and OCR and specifically, and do a lot of work with computing at school and BCS. So project-based learning and physical computing more specifically is very, very close to my heart, and I'm a keen advocate for using digital technology to teach computing specifically. So let's dive straight into what PBL is all about and how it's defined, or rather how it isn't defined. When I first started adventuring into the world of PBL, specifically around physical computing, I found that it's very, very poorly defined. It's sort of described in very, very loose terms in a lot of the literature. And it's often mistaken for a very, very simplistic approach of just sort of learning through doing or learning through exploration. And I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. And that's this started on a long journey of finding out and working out a way of how to deliver computing lessons specifically in a way which is suitable for learners and maximizes their progress and more importantly, their engagement. And so this is sort of a bit of a map of all of the different elements that make up project-based learning, specifically in computing, but more generally as well, project-based learning and all the different elements that have to come together for teachers to be able to deliver this effectively. And I think this is part of the struggle with project-based learning, is that it involves having some sort of pedagogical content knowledge and subject knowledge, and being confident in applying that in quite novel and interesting and different ways. And it's sort of tying all of these different elements together to be an effective practitioner. And I think that's what makes it difficult to adopt in schools initially, because teachers need to be confident in all of these different areas. And the areas highlighted here are the ones typically that I see where teachers aren't confident. Specifically in computing, it's around programming initially. There's lots and lots of non-specialist teachers, and they need to be able to apply that on the hardware that they're trying to use. And knowledge of the hardware is also can be quite daunting if they're not familiar with physical computing devices like microbits, Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, and those sorts of things. And you need to have some sort of, at least a shallow knowledge of basic electronics to be able to engage with that sort of technology. And that's what makes it quite difficult. So, and that's just the kit that you use to do project-based learning, never mind the underlying pedagogy and the practice in the classroom. And so all of these different elements kind of need to come together, and teachers need to be confident to be able to do this well. And so the bits highlighted are the bits I'm going to focus on today, in this, because these are some of the sort of problem areas, alongside assessment as well, which is another element which can be quite taxing when it comes to project-based learning. So a little bit just to exemplify what what physical computing looks like. And straight away you can see from this, this is the microbit. This is a device which is very, very popular. It's used in schools all over the world to do physical computing. And those of you who aren't familiar with the microbit, you can see straight away why this might be off-putting to teachers, just from the sort of language that it uses. It's talking about analog and digital input output, and some of these quite technical terms. And so that is straight away a bit of a learning curve for some teachers, is getting past the sort of physicality of it. But once you understand what all these different elements mean and what they do, it's quite easy to engage with it. But these kinds of boards open up the doors to doing all sorts of really interesting things, specifically data logging, which is really, really trendy at the moment, with data science sort of starting to emerge and blossom into a new subject, sort of sitting somewhere between maths and computer science. And so there's an awful lot that can be done with these relatively powerful and cheap boards. And if you're interested, I've got a YouTube video on all the different features on the microbit. To sort of conceptualize what these boards do, because this is just one example, there are many different ones out there, like Crumbles and Raspberry Pis, etc., is to think about these boards almost like mini smartphones. You can see there the sort of feature lists are very, very comparable, and a smartphone is a bit like a microbit, just with a much more powerful processor and screen and memory and all those sorts of things. But they essentially do the same sort of thing. They take in data, you can interact with them, and then you can do other things with them. And that's what allows it to be fully cross-curricular. You can not teach just not computing, but you can use them to measure almost anything. So it sits alongside science. You can use in physics experiments. You can use for biology, geography, anything you can use your imagination to teach it with. So specifically for computing, there is another tool, another element which can be quite daunting for teachers, is the computer science element of it. So how do you actually program this sort of thing? Because lots of teachers aren't fully confident programmers, and this has been done with the microbit using an interface called MakeCode, which is an online IDE, an integrated development environment. That allows you to sort of drag these colorful blocks around and create programs really easily and quickly. And it's really, really engaging for students, because it's stuff that they may be familiar with from primary school, and it's quick and easy to sort of rapidly prototype programs really, really quickly. And the students take to this really, really quickly. It's the teachers that can sometimes be a little bit slower and less confident in doing this, which is really interesting. There's a sort of there's a leap of faith that they have to take to be able to try and do anything slightly more complex with this sort of stuff. And a lot of this, and a lot of the CPD that I carry out is involved in sort of upskilling teachers in what all these different elements do and how to use them to solve complex problems. And that's again a key part of project-based learning, is solving real-world problems using computer science and physical devices, and it's sort of tying those elements together in a way that really switches students on. So The marker bit is just, again, just one example, and it laterally lends itself to computer science, but with the data that you can capture from that, you can also teach data science and IoT, electronics, and obviously data science leads into the maths world as well. And then if you start to use project-based learning to create physical computing artifacts, that lends itself nicely to design technology. There's an engineering element to that as well as using it as a measuring device for all the STEM lessons like the sciences. There's the classic physics lessons with rolling things down ramps and measuring velocity and acceleration, those sorts of things, and all of that you can do on these physical devices. So let's talk a little bit about context. So another big part of PBL that needs to be probably arguably the most important element of project-based learning is the context. It's that hook that gets students interested in applying this technology and these and the theory in a way that means something to them. And sort of an underlying theory across all of computing project-based learning is this Internet of Things. And it's one of these buzzwords that can be quite meaningless to a lot of people. But really, it's just about adding electronics to everything, and those electronics gathering data and then maybe transmitting that data, and then that data being interrogated and analyzed, and then using that to solve either a problem or to help people in their lives. This is a classic example of the smart home. We've all seen Hives and the rest of it that can automate the use of your central heating or television or lights or whatever. So that's a very simplistic example, but this can be applied to almost anything, any industry, any subject, and that's a sort of an underlying set of context that we can start to engage learners with. This also fits into other areas such as infrastructure, agriculture, medical ones. I think a good example, which I've seen recently, is a pacemaker. And traditionally, a pacemaker is just used to regulate the heartbeat. Adding in a sort of an IoT angle to that, that can be used to transmit using the 5G network when someone's arrhythmia starts to play up, or maybe when the heart stops, and that can be used to contact the emergency services, and then they can be guided by GPS from this device to exactly where that person is. The doctor, the specialists can be contacted straight away, so they can see all the data being generated by this device, and they know then the OR can be prepped, ready to receive them should the worst happen. So it's really sort of closing the loop of the real world and the digital world, helping each other out in the most efficient way possible, using the data that's generated and doing clever things with it. And that's really the sort of the hook of IoT is trying to find a real world problem that you can solve using data and obviously the physical devices that gather that data, and solving a real problem with it. And that's the sort of an underlying theme. That leads nicely into the sort of the data science element, which I touched upon earlier. This is one of these new embryonic sort of subjects, which is becoming very, very popular. Lots of people are talking about data science and how we can start to introduce it into the formal curriculum. Where does it sit, and what can you do with it? And I think a project-based learning is a really good opportunity to start to play around with some of these ideas, because the students can generate their own data using physical devices and then interrogate it and do some interesting stats on it. We've seen some experiments with various organizations in maths that do this for A-level, and there's a lot of work to be done in this space, but it's a fascinating area to explore how we can use project-based learning and physical computing to sort of make it more real for students wanting to study data science and its applications. So another element here is it's misconceiving, or I suppose a very shallow understanding about what physical computing and project-based learning is. And it's not just about using EdTech. It's about using it in a constructive and a sort of project-based way to solve real problems. I see examples, or some of the worst examples I've seen of project-based learning is when they give them something a bit like that robot there in the top left, where they give them essentially a toy that's pre-built, and they go and use that. And that's not really project-based learning. That's they're just playing with an artifact. From the way that we conceive of it in the ARM School program is really you need to design and build the artifact yourself from scratch, and you're drawing together these different skill sets of engineering, electronics, computer science, and other ones as well to actually physically build something. You can see the boat at the bottom there, which one of our project days is a really good example of them, this autonomous boat drone. So it's a slightly more complex way of doing it, which makes it more difficult to use in the classroom, but it's the value and the gains are much greater than just giving them a sort of a pre-made device. Sticking on that on the previously mentioned idea of context is because it's got to be something that students can engage with, and it's got to be something that they can relate to and understand, and to really engage them, it needs to be something they feel like they're giving something back to the world and solving the real problem. It can't just be something trivial. And the global goals are a really good set of real world context that try to capture all the sort of the problems in the world that learners will be familiar with, and probably affecting them directly. And you can use these as context to create projects to try and solve these problems. And each of these goals has got lots of underlying goals underneath them. And it's a case of coming up with projects that that they can buy into and feel like they're contributing to society and to the bigger picture by applying technology in innovative and meaningful ways. And an example of that is this boat drone, which obviously just mentioned a second ago, where they have to meet this success criteria, which is part of our PBL approach within the Armed Score program, where they have to build this interactive boat drone. They have to think about all the ambient conditions on the water, so wind and waves and all that sort of stuff, and they have to program this thing to be able to navigate around and work with other drones. And so you can use things like radio frequencies and all the rest of it to get these things to communicate with each other. And it's this is sort of the most simplistic take on it, and this can be differentiated upwards almost infinitely, and you can do this project with really young students and just use this success criteria here, and then you can add in things like the radio comms and use things like GPS and all that sort of that to make it more complicated, to make it more attractive and more technical for older learners. So yeah, there's an awful lot that you can do with these sorts of technologies to create interesting and engaging and highly technical projects that aren't just a trivial engagement. So what are some of the teaching tools that you need to be able to do this as well? And a key part of all projects is about taking something in, doing something with it, and spitting something out. So input, process, and output, and that kind of underpins a lot of the physical computing projects that you might see used with project-based learning. And I think this can be lends itself to all sorts of different projects that can do in almost any subject. But that's a sort of a key pillar of how we conceptualize project-based learning is taking something into digital inputs on a device, processing that computationally, and then having some sort of output, be it through a motor, transmitting of data, or storing that data, for example, and then then that goes into data science, etc., as we mentioned before. So that's a key bit of it. And another one which lends itself to sort of 21st century skills and more into sort of the technical industries and STEM industries is this iterative development cycle, working in an agile way and getting students to work on projects, not in a waterfall way, just give them a problem and they solve it, but giving them some quite challenging success criteria, getting them to think about and plan and design a solution to that, develop it, test it, evaluate it, and then go through that cycle again and keep doing that. Fail early, fail often. And that's a real key part in that delivery, is that teaching them to be resilient learners and not just doing it for the sake of doing it, which you can see sometimes in computing lessons where you're learning like what an if statement is just for the sake of it on a theoretical level, rather than applying it in something which is meaningful to the learners. Another element of this sort of teaching approach is semantic waves, which is very trendy at the moment. You see this in a lot in the National Computer and NCCE resources. And it's this idea of starting with an abstract concept, say, for example, for loops, and then unpacking that and then making it real and concrete. And they use the example there of unplugged activities and metaphors. And I would argue you could add in there project-based learning as well, and give them projects where they can, in a concrete fashion, use these abstract concepts to achieve something meaningful. For example, applying it to write an algorithm for a robot or a boat drone or whatever. And then towards the end of the lesson, repacking it and then reusing that technical language and linking back those abstract concepts to what they've already learned. So I think that's an incredibly powerful tool of thinking about in those sorts of senses. They're almost learning about the subject through the process of project-based learning by accident. They're doing an activity which is fun and engaging, but this has been cleverly designed to get into the nitty-gritty theory that you're trying to get them to learn. And I think that's a really useful diagram. A sort of a fringe benefit of project-based learning is also the 6 C's. Fullen's this lovely diagram about getting students to work together on projects, not just individually. You get them to collaborate and talk to each other and work through that iterative process. And by doing so, they become sort of active citizens. They're being creative. They're collaborating. And again, there's all sorts of pedagogical tools here about mixing up the genders, mixing up different peer groups, and those sorts of things. And they have to apply critical thinking skills and communication and all of that to achieve these these projects in a way that's efficient for time. You have to squeeze these things into a lesson or 2 lessons ideally. So fitting project-based learning into the formal curriculum can be tricky. And the idea of project-based learning isn't to fully replace the formal curriculum at all. It's just another set of tools, and it's a different way of thinking about delivering learning. And it's probably not something you want to do every single lesson with. And certainly in our resources, we have like normal lessons for 3 or 4 lessons, and then we do projects to reinforce and build upon that learning and get them to use it almost as an assessment tool to see that they can apply it meaningfully. So just looking at some of the wider picture, just want to take a step back a little bit. This is a slide or an image taken from our edX course on project-based learning, which is released, and you can find it on edX. It's teaching with physical computing, and this is called the learning landscape. And this is all of the different sort of practices and orthodoxies and theories that underpin project-based learning. And there's obviously an awful lot going on this slide and lots of words kicking about, but the courses go through and explain all of this sort of stuff and how they link together. And it's really, really good stuff. It was put together by a colleague, John Woolard at Southampton University. And it's a really interesting mix and really good way of visually representing what's going on under PBL, because it is complex and there's a lot of stuff that has to come together to make this work.
Rob, I'm going to have to cut you off there, unfortunately. Thank you so much for that overview and those key definitions and principles. I really hope we're going to get to see a lot more of that in the question section and hear lots more examples. But thanks for that fantastic sort of grounding in some of the key principles and structures. Thank you. I'm going to pass over for a short introduction now to Chanel. Thanks again, Rob.
All right, can you hear me? Awesome, perfect. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. My name is Chanel Johnson, and I just want to talk to you about my journey and where project-based learning played a part in it. So again, my name is Chanel Johnson. If you are on Twitter, please connect with me as DC STEMtastic, where we can go through this journey together in learning and staying connected. I find that to be extremely important in my educational journey, and I'll briefly talk about the importance of being a connected educator and how it can help strengthen you in your educational journey, especially in project-based learning. So just an overview of my experience. I started off as a middle grade math and science teacher. I taught a diverse group of students, different social economic statuses, different instructional needs. But what came to be true is that all students, regardless of your social economic status, regardless of your instructional needs, all students can learn and all students are capable of project-based learning. And oftentimes I've worked with teachers who, well, my kids can't do this. Yes, they can. And it's very important that we as educators diminish that mindset. But I had the opportunity, the greatest experiences of my life as a teacher, where I got the opportunity to experience project-based learning, because again, it can be scary. I'm letting go of control, but giving my students a chance to get themselves out there to make mistakes, it was an amazing experience. And I was able to witness that firsthand. After that, I became a school-based STEM coordinator, STEM, science, technology, engineering, math coordinator for a school. So now I'm no longer working with students. The shift has changed. Now you're working with adults and you're having to build STEM awareness. Now you're having to explain what project-based learning is and how they can apply it in their classroom. And in Georgia, we have what is called the STEM certification, where you are recognized by the state based on certain criteria that you are STEM certified school. And a lot of those criteria align to project-based learning. I was in that position, and then afterwards, I became district level. So now I'm no longer impacting one school, one classroom. Now we're working in an entire district. And this is one of the largest districts in Georgia and one of the top 100 in the United States. And from there, I am district level, supporting K-12, math, science, instructional technology, STEM, and a little bit of computer science. And this gives me a pulse on what are the needs? How do we support? I'm writing curriculum for teachers, providing that professional development. So I'm really boots on the ground, hands-on on what's going on and how we can support our students. And then currently, now I have a narrow focus on K-5 science, where I'm supporting 36 schools, but we are engaging in science instruction, and we're also integrating. So we're not just looking at science, we're integrating with technology, we're integrating with math, we're integrating even in ELA. And then of course, on top of that, if you don't think I'm busy enough, I am also the Georgia Science Association Vice President. That is our teacher, that is our science teacher association for our state. So now I get a pulse on the state and what the needs are. And it's been a privilege. So what I have for you really quickly is just some examples of my journey. Regardless of who I'm serving, the mission is the same. Whether I'm serving students, whether I'm supporting and serving teachers, the mission is the same. All students can learn, all students can engage in project-based learning. But what I wanted to kind of briefly highlight was the difference between a project and project-based learning. And Rob definitely did an amazing job talking about it. And I'll just briefly talk about some of those things. That it can be student-directed. That is not something that where all projects have the same goal. And it's based on real-world experiences or problems. So, and I wanted to highlight kind of on the experience part and not the problem part so that you can get an idea of what we're looking at. A couple of the pictures that you see here are my students. They actually are developing a roller coaster. They have criteria. They are applying science concepts, math concepts, engineering design process, because I gave difficult criteria. It needs to be freestanding. It can't attach to a wall. And so there was so much criteria and testing and teamwork they had to do to accomplish this project. And then the end audience wasn't Ms. Johnson. The end audience was your peers and other teachers. So this was your opportunity to see, did your project work? Was your project the best roller coaster? Because they got to rate. So that means they took ownership. They really took ownership in what they were doing. And in this particular project here, Rob, you mentioned this as well about the difference between technology, just having a robot that's pre-built. Well, this is an example of a drone that they had to construct and develop from scratch. So not only did my students have to develop it from scratch, you have to compete with students in other schools. And this is, and I love mentioning this very brief story about the importance of equity and having all voices, because in this project was a little girl who didn't think she belonged, but it was her idea that had them win the project. And one of the tasks was having a soft landing with your drone. And she thought, why not use hair rollers? And the boys are thinking, wait, what? And so she brought in the hair rollers. And they tried it and it worked and they won. So that was the importance of equity. That was the importance of empowering all voices, which is something that I am strong about. Let's see. And that goes to my next point of just going beyond your four walls. I could not sit here today to tell you that my journey, I got to where I am and where I'm going without connecting with other people, without thinking beyond my four walls. And that's the power of connecting. And I just want to briefly talk about those benefits of being a connected educator and why it can help you in your PBL journey. Being able to connect on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or whatever social media platform you have, we're all sharing our project-based learning experiences. We're sharing our resources. So this is a good place to learn, connect, ask your questions. So many opportunities have come for me from just being a connected educator. And I wanted to highlight the importance of that and how it will definitely enhance your project-based learning. Just a simple hashtag, project-based learning. You're going to see so much resources. So if you haven't done it, I encourage you to do so. And that is all that I have. And I can't wait for us to actually talk a little more.
Here, Chanel, thank you so much. Great to hear about your practical experiences, and I hope that the people on this call are getting a sense of which perspective each of our panelists are bringing, and are going to be buzzing with questions to ask them in the next section. Thanks so much, Chanel. And I'm going to hand over, last but not least, to Mark.
Let's see. I think I need Chanel to stop sharing in order to be able to share. Let's try it again here. And Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Mark Miller. I'm quite honored to be here, and so delighted to hear from colleagues who have so many similar thoughts about what this approach to education means and how to go about doing it well. And I'm blown away by the people who are in the audience, and I look forward to hearing from them. I run a nonprofit called learningtech.org, and I'm on the adjunct faculty at Northeastern University. So let me see here. There we go. So a little bit more about me. We help schools with ed tech. We help them get government funding. There's a program in the US called E-Rate, and that's a very challenging program, but it's the main source of money. So that's why we help them with that one. One of the things we help is with STEAM education, and particularly computer science. That's my personal passion. I've worked with students down to age 9 or 10, all the way up through higher ed. Most of my teaching right now is actually with graduate students. But I think one of my favorite spots in there is probably middle school, and we've heard some examples of that. I spent a decade at Apple Computer, or now it's just called Apple. I was lab director of learning and tools, and this was in days when Apple had a research lab. And we did lots of research on things like smarter tools for authoring and so on. I've done a venture, venture capital startup that was using AI to teach adult programmers. I've worked at TI for a couple of years. I helped launch their machine intelligence group. I did my Ph.D. at MIT in 1979, and that was when the main language that was taught to children was Logo, which is kind of a precursor to Scratch, actually. And one of the things about it was, of course, the notion that not only constructivism, which essentially means that the student is constructing their own knowledge, but constructionism. So you actually have to build an artifact in the world. And I was really delighted to hear Rob mention that idea, and I think it was echoed by Chanel as well. What we're really talking about is building artifact. Now, the artifact might be on the screen, but especially with younger children, I think it's really important to build a physical artifact. So tools like the microbit and the Raspberry Pi and so on, various kinds of robotic systems allow the students to build something that does something in the world. And that gives them an aha moment that they don't get in any other way. Nobody's excited about having your computer program that prints hello world on the screen and adds up an array of numbers, right? Everyone's excited, even if it's a turtle on the floor drawing with a pen, to have it draw a hello world and to have a little bit of creativity and fun with it. That becomes interesting. Other things about me, I'm a sort of a social justice advocate or ally. I'm an old white guy, but I really care about the rest of the world too. Personally, I can't see my grandson, so I'm a big fan of cats. That's Jake and Elwood that you see there, in case you've seen the movie The Blues Brothers. I'm a martial artist, and that's one of the things I also teach. And I love music and chess. Okay, let's move forward here. All right, so I looked at who the other speakers were and what kind of audience we're going to have. And I should say I do not need to explain what project-based learning is to this audience. I don't even need to present the evidence that supports it. What I wanted to do is say, look at my own experience doing it and say, where did it work well? What were the ingredients that made it successful? And I hope sharing that will be of value. I think everyone will say authentic topic. Now, I add a little bit to that not everyone does, and that is student choice. So when the student has the opportunity to define, now that doesn't mean it's completely unlimited or out of the scope of what you're trying to teach, but if they have a range of possibilities, for example, my graduate students might have a constraint in one of my classes that they have to use the Python language. They may attach other things to it, right? But then it can be pretty wide open. I mean, it turns out that's critically important. Students who would walk away and say, oh, I'm not interested in this stuff, suddenly become very, very engaged and committed when they got to decide what it's going to be about. Okay. Another ingredient that I found is extremely helpful is that there's an audience that's beyond the teacher. This is, on Friday, we're going to have a show and tell, the mayor is going to come. You can bring your grandparents. And so being ready for that show and tell, or a kind of moment or sort of, it can be a gallery walk. There's various formats it can take, but having that opportunity to show off what you have built at some point is extremely valuable to students. Another thing that's important, and it's actually important in two ways, is the idea of role models for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's in two ways. One is depending on, what students you have in the room. Some of them are sitting there going, well, I don't belong here, sort of imposter syndrome. That's for other kids. That's not for me, right? So they need to see role models of successful people, people of color, women, depending on the age group and their knowledge of the world, people who are gay, like Alan Turing. But the other side of it, and I don't think this is often thought about as much, but I'm going to try to highlight it a little bit in my examples today, is that you want to give those students, and some of them will emerge as potential role models for the future, and they can become almost like teaching assistants. And we often use, for example, high school students to help us teach middle school students and things like that. And they become role models because like, oh, well, if you could learn to do that, I could probably do it too. I think it's really, really important. And we all use the word resilience, but what I like to tie it back to, and this is from the teachings of Seymour Papert, which is, from my work at MIT on logo and so on, is think of resilience as a mindset that's centered around debugging. So there's this one little box in the diagram which says, essentially, testing and fixing and so on. But if you think about what computer scientists do, they probably spend something like 40% of their time debugging. And so I tell my students, bugs are good. I mean, not if you're on the space station and there's a bug there that's going to happen in real time or something like that. But when you're learning this stuff, and whether it's how to build something physically or how to write the software to drive it or whatever, if the thing works the first time, you learned a little bit. You applied what was taught in the class and so on, and you built something, and that was fun. But when there's a bug, and especially if it's a hard bug or there's more than one bug, and you spend a lot of time tracking it down, troubleshooting, figuring out where it's happening, and then identifying it, naming it. And I think naming it is actually really important, classifying it, and then understanding how to fix it. That's when you go, oh, and that's when you really learn something. So especially with the younger ones, I actually make them say, bugs are good. We say it as a group. Okay, talk about bugs, everybody. Bugs are good, right? And that's how they develop that resilience. I think it's really important. Another ingredient is you're going to end up in the course of any project, and this is true if you're a graduate student, or a fifth grader, about halfway through, you're going to realize that the scope of what you set out to do was pretty ambitious. Now, there's a rubric that you have to meet, but most of the project proposals, especially when there's pretty open student choice, right, are way, way more ambitious than is realistic. And so planning that you are going to kind of do a check-in, and say, am I going to be able to have this running by Friday afternoon or whenever the deadline is? Do I need to change what I'm trying to do? Maybe I don't need these features. What the Silicon Valley thing is, what is the minimum viable product, right? So going from here's my dream to what is the minimum viable project shouldn't be like something that you're ashamed that you had to do, but it's actually something that you expected and planned for. And that also provides a great sense of kind of reduced anxiety for the students who are like, there's no way I'm going to make that work, right? And at some point they do. One thing that I don't hear mentioned as much as I would have expected is is having respect for the student as an intellectual agent. It's so important. Like, I'm the teacher, I know how to do everything, and I'm going to convey my knowledge to you, is totally the wrong approach. It's like, these are amazingly intelligent creatures trying to figure out the world. And your role is not just to fill their heads with facts. Your role is to help them succeed. And I think I skipped over my third one, which was mentoring. I have various titles in various contexts. One of the ones that I find almost offensive is lecturer. And in fact, the university model, which dates to the Middle Ages, right, is I spend 3 hours, actually 3 hours and 15 minutes lecturing, where students listen, right? And then we have a recitation where they recite back what they heard, right? That's a few days later if they can still remember it. And that's totally not how I think about my relationship with the students. I think of myself as a mentor. So it's not instruction, it's mentoring. And you can't mentor if you don't have respect for the person that you're mentoring. So it's so important. One I want to mention, and this is an ingredient that is for the person that's in the role of the teacher or the mentor or the facilitator, is it takes courage to do this. It takes serious courage to be able to model lifelong learning, to be able to say, I'm not sure I know how to do this either, but let's learn together. And that's like a revelation for students, and it is so much more fun than what they usually experience in the classroom. And the last point, and I love that Chanel mentioned this, is when a project has connections to the outer community, it makes a huge difference. It's somewhat related to who the audience is, but especially if you can, for example, make a connection even to the adult community, that people are interested in what you're doing. And we've got examples of that in our community. Okay, so I want to give a couple of examples where I felt that one or another, or maybe several of these ingredients are highlighted. Okay.
Mark, just as a heads up, I think we've probably got time for one example, so that we've got a full half hour for questions, if that's all right.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see here. So this is a student named Isaiah Sneed. His story was his grandfather had serious breathing issues and needed to use what's called an incentive spirometer. The problem was his grandfather was old and frail, couldn't read the markings on it. So you're given goals, you try to breathe and so on. And it's critical for you to be able to stay healthy, is to be able to reach a certain level and build up every day and so on. So it's a highly authentic example of a project. He built a better one that involved having an LED light up when you reached a certain level. I mean, kind of classic sort of things you could do with, say, a microbit or something like that. Runner-up at the county science fair for building this project. But the NAACP actually saw this project and gave him an award to expand CS and STEAM opportunities for young Black males. And he then went on to build a group of followers and brought a whole bunch of other Black males from his school and nearby schools into science and STEAM and computer science. If I go quickly, can I fit in one more, do you think, Julia?
Unfortunately not, Mark. Sorry, I'm going to be really strict.
Man.
Thank you so much, but I hope that you can bring it into the answers to the questions.
Of course.
Thank you so much for that overview of your top thoughts on project-based learning, and echoing so many themes that we heard from both Rob and Chanel. I'm going to kick off with a big question that we got from Panellist a few days ago from Anita, who's a chemistry teacher at the Good Shepherd International School in Ooty in India. And her question was, what's the best way to integrate project-based learning within the curriculum? Does anyone want to volunteer to kick that off? And just a reminder to anyone listening, you can add your questions to the Q&A panel. Chanel, go for it.
Ask the question one more time. Just ask it one more time.
The question was, what's the best way to integrate project-based learning within the curriculum?
So we're going to go with twofold with this. When you're integrating, I'm assuming that you're wanting to add other contents. So we can't integrate without collaboration. If you're wanting to integrate with math, if you wanted to integrate with health and PE, when we're getting into chemicals and what's in our foods and or whatnot, you have to be able to collaborate with other teachers. And I always believe, start with your standards. What does your standard say? Where do the connection, where can you see those connections? And then when it comes to even integrating technology, always think about, what is the intended outcome? I'm not using a tool just because, you know, it's cool, it's cute, it's fancy. What is the intended purpose of this tool, and how it's going to help support me? So collaboration, being intentional about what you're using, and then of course, transferable ideas. So if you're integrating different ideas within chemistry, making sure that you're using cross-cutting concepts and transferable ideas.
As a first step, just start small, keep it simple, pick a single project, just do a single lesson, and think of a context which is engaging to your learners, and you know, almost work backwards. Start with the solution, and think about how students could interpret that problem and build a lesson around it in the project-based learning format. You know, so let them explore, but just make sure that you've got scaffolding there to support the learners so that they don't just get lost. You know, you got to make sure you differentiate it effectively and give them the tools that they need to succeed. But start simple and go from there.
Thanks, Rob. And as a follow-up question to that, Jane from the Raspberry Pi Foundation asked, for complex topics, is there any place for more traditional scheduled taught elements, or should all learning be just in time? That's something you touched on, Rob. I wonder if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, project-based learning isn't a sort of a full replacement to the normal curriculum, and you know, some things need to be taught in a slightly more didactic fashion, and it's just a tool to your quiver. It really depends on the subject and where they are in their learning. I mean, I say in the resources that I design, you have normal lessons which have elements of projects in there, so they have activities which are related to the theme, the context, the hardware that they're using, and then you'll have a full-blown exploratory project at the end which revisits all of that. You know, that spiral learning model where they learn things in a granular fashion, and then it's reinforced and made concrete at the end of a series of lessons. So yeah, it's not meant to throw everything out and start again. It's just another tool to try and engage learners. And you wouldn't want to do project-based learning for absolutely everything. I certainly wouldn't, because students would get bored of that as an approach as well. And you want to make sure that you're bringing everybody along, and that doesn't necessarily work for every single type of learner. So yeah, it's that, just use it sparingly or whenever it's most appropriate.
I just wanted to add one thought on that. I found it really helpful to use short videos in a sort of flipped classroom model that students actually watch before they come and start to work on whatever the project is. And then I often found that they go back and they kind of stop it and they replay little parts of it and so on as they're trying to figure out how to do things. It's like, oh, I saw something about that in the video. That can be really helpful. So as Rob says, it doesn't replace everything that you do. It's one tool, but it's extremely valuable tool, and it really builds motivation.
Brilliant. And just to build on your answers again, there was another question from Ruth from New Zealand, who was asking, how do you provide for differentiation within the lessons to address the needs of all students?
I can start with that. So when we talk about differentiation, differentiation can be from product and the content, and then just the process. So when we talk about differentiation as far as content, thinking about when we're doing project-based learning, what are the skills that my students need in order to accomplish this project? So I'll give an example of a unit that I wrote where students had to create a game using pushes and pulls, and they had to use it all out of cardboard. And so they were engineers developing their own game, and the skills they needed to understand what force and motion is. They need to understand Newton's laws. They need to understand certain mathematical concepts. But as they were going through that project and gaining those skills, what I noticed through formative assessment, I may have some students who are struggling. So that's that key right there, formative assessments. You have to know what your students need. You have to be able to assess that learning. So from formative assessments, I was able to see, okay, I have a group of students who are still struggling with pushes and pulls. Let's go ahead and form a small group here so that I can give you the support that you need. That's differentiation. And then when we get even into the product, that goes into how you are representing the project, given that student choice, that student agency that Mark mentioned, that we're giving. I'm telling you, I want a game. I'm telling you cardboard, but I didn't tell you what the name of the game is. I didn't tell you how I wanted it to look. I just gave you some criteria. Here are the skills you need. I'm going to support you along the way. We're going to formatively assess along the way, and I'm going to give you the support you need as we go. And then you're going to come with a product.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in a little bit. I want to give an example that really speaks to that, because I think one of the real strengths of project-based learning is in fact that each project can be different, and so differentiation based on the student's background is quite possible. So if I can share my screen really quickly, I'll show one more example here. So hopefully you can see my screen. So this was a scholarship student, coming from a highly disadvantaged background. He came to a maker kind of camp where we had, laser cutters and 3D printers and, plastic sketching things. And we had cardboard and we had wood and we had all this different stuff. And we were trying to get some of the basic skills in being a good scientist and engineer, such as keeping a good engineering notebook. And every time you take a measurement or try something, you write down your results and you're quantitative about it so that you can then go back and make sense and make corrections. And the premise was you could only use the stuff that's in this room, but you could make anything that you think you can make in 1 week. So this student came to us and said, I want to build essentially the hoverboard from Back to the Future 2. If anyone has seen that movie, I imagine most people have. And the initial reaction, my colleague, Dr. Worth, and I looked at each other and we were like, oh, do we just say no? Do we just veto this one? Because we don't know how to do this. And this comes back to that point about the courage to model lifelong learning. We didn't actually think it was possible, but we thought, well, maybe we can help him, carefully define the scope and so on. So we get to like Friday of a 1-week program and it's almost noon. And we finally have reached the point where he's agreed that if he can pass a sheet of paper underneath this little thing that he's made out of wood and cardboard with fans and batteries, right? Then that's sufficient. That means it's hovering, right? So it's like, what is the core definition of its hovering? You can slide something completely underneath it and it doesn't fall down. Once he agreed to that, he was able to actually pull it off. This was a student who didn't have a lot of math, engineering, science kind of skill coming in, but he had that passion for it. And the project was like, gave him the motivation to persevere. Right? When the parents came by in the sort of gallery walk sort of thing and asked him about it, he would end his speech by saying, I think he might say this is one of the best things I've ever done in my life. He actually said, this is the only good thing I have ever done in my life. And so when you get that kind of an impact on a student, you've changed a life. And that's what keeps me wanting to do project-based learning.
Thanks, Mark, for sharing that fantastic example. We've had quite a few people, including Shireen, on the call who've been asking, do you have any examples of project-based learning ideas for language, for English language, maybe within the context of STEM, but maybe more broadly, but language-focused projects? Well,
that's an easy one in computer science. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do depending on the age group and skill level and so on in terms of programming, computer generated poetry, or you can even use current libraries that do machine learning to recognize spoken input and then have the computer cause some action to occur in the world as a result of a command that you've given it and so on. That's very, very exciting for students at various ages.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And a reminder to any of the participants, you can message Mark separately if you're interested in hearing more about some of those projects. I saw you nodding, Rob. Did you have any examples you wanted to add as well?
It's well, if they're learning English as a foreign language, you can bake the application and demonstration of the skills of that language into almost any project. It's just thinking about something that's going to engage those students more directly. So it could be creating some sort of asset or artifact by applying those language skills wherever they are in their learning journey. So it's just have to think about what context will work, what you're trying to get them to demonstrate, and then molding those two things together. So it's coming with project ideas is probably the hardest part about a PBL, is finding something that does work as a context and also covers the subject content and theory and assessment elements that you want it to in a sufficiently complex way. So that is definitely a hard bit, and there are tools out there to help you do that. But yeah, it's coming up with ideas on the spot is quite difficult.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Rob. You touched on something. You touched on assessment there, and I know the questions are absolutely buzzing on all things project-based learning and assessment. So we're going to go on to that now. We had a question from Anita from Cambridge Assessment who asked, what impact does a summative assessment or high-stakes assessment have on project-based learning?
That's a complex one to unpick. Because obviously teachers are driven by the formal curriculum and the sorts of things they have to cover, especially at GCSE and CSJ standards, and depending on what level they're at. But making that part of the context is really, really important. And if you're trying to cover a set of content, say to a GCSE, for example, especially in computer science, it naturally lends itself to projects anyway. So making sure that you're covering the formal curriculum within that context is important, because otherwise, if you're kind of going off piste, it may be perceived as a waste of time. And the assessment, we need to unpack the sort of the assessment and the learning as two separate things. We don't want the assessment tail to wag the product or project dog, as it were, and it's an important thing to consider. But you shouldn't be tailoring projects to be geared towards completing an assessment. That's a different way of doing it. It's whilst you will be naturally covering the content that's being assessed in the formal curriculum, you shouldn't really consider the method of assessment to influence the type of project that you're doing. It's two completely different things. But yeah, the subject content is certainly important and should speak to the project.
I would emphasize the point about having an audience that is broader than the teacher. When you have outsiders, other teachers, older students, but see your project, I mean, you can see on their faces whether you've hit the mark, and having very well-defined rubrics so they understand what it is that the judges are looking for. But inviting judges from outside the classroom, I think, really helps.
Thanks, Mark. Chanel, did you want to add something?
Yes, from my experience as a classroom teacher, I was often in the grade that was a high stake testing grade level. So this is the test that's going to determine, unfortunately, if you are an impactful teacher or not. And you have to make a decision. My data is tied to my effectiveness as an educator, but I need my students to participate in PBL. How do I make it happen? So what I've learned, again, starting with the standards, and just a brief example, I had students build me a compound machine that could pop a balloon quietly and consistently, because I'm scared of balloon pops and my students care about my well-being. So design me a machine that can pop balloons consistently and as quiet as possible. So from those concepts, you need to understand simple machines. So while we're engaging in learning, you're getting those skills of simple machines, what they do. You're also understanding sound energy. You're understanding just so many other contents. Again, force and motion. So along the way, while we're going through instruction, and then I know Mark mentioned flipped classroom, the importance of that is just huge, because we need to spend time in class working, not you getting this information. You need to do that at home. So anyway, but again, going back to the assessment, I should know before that high stake assessment get there. I might not know exactly what's on the test, but I do know the standards. And I should know before that assessment how my students are going to perform, because I am assessing along the way while we're doing PBL, while we're practicing those skills. Because again, before I give you a product, I need you practicing. I need you to be able to identify what simple machines are and what they do. And then tell me how this can help your project. So it's all connected.
It's briefly on assessment as well. I mean, you can assess PBL itself and the skills you're trying to cover really easily in PBL. In fact, we've got an entire course on how to assess PBL on edX. So please do check that out.
Thanks, Rob. And what advice would you give to people like one of our participants who said they're teaching to a high stakes exam framework that they feel doesn't recognize skills so strongly? How can they make sure students are getting recognition for the work they're doing with PBL? What advice would you give to an educator in that position?
from my angle as a computer science teacher, I think the using PBL to teach computing is incredibly powerful tool to make them confident, especially with like non-specialist teachers, because the difficult part is getting them to apply, for example, computational techniques and concepts confidently in novel situations, which they will experience as part of their formal assessment. And so you need to get them to be able to think computationally, think algorithmically, and doing that is you need to do that through practice. And so giving them projects where they are applying things in a real life project, they can connect, the real world and that concrete example of that code running to that theoretical thing that you want them to be able to understand and recall and regurgitate later on. And that can sometimes be quite difficult for learners, because if they're learning it in an abstract sense, just on the board, and say learning what an if statement is just in an abstract sense is quite difficult. Getting them to apply it to solve a real world problem makes them remember it, and they can recall it much more easily. So it just builds confidence, and it gives them opportunities to practice these skills over and over again. And that makes them more proficient at answering these sorts of questions in exams.
One of the reasons why I really like project-based learning is that different students are able to show their knowledge and expertise in different ways. I have some students who are doing perfectly well on homework or whatever. As soon as they get to a timed assessment, especially if it's a high percentage of their grade, they completely freeze and they're unable to perform. So that's why I've eliminated final exams from courses that I teach, and instead there is a midterm, but there's also a final project rather than a final exam. So that gives them a different way to demonstrate their mastery of the material. And I think that mixing that and having different weights, so that no one timed assessment is going to kill you, is really great when you have the freedom to do that. Unfortunately, at least in the US, there are assessments that you can't get out of that are terrifying to some students. And I think we should change that.
Thanks, Mark. And sort of building on that in these challenge of trying to marry up these summative assessment requirements with real outcomes and project-based learning. One of our participants asked, is there a recipe or a formula for designing project-based learning? How would you go about it? I'd love to hear some examples from your experience.
From the Armed School program has developed a schema, and that's the slide I was on just as I stopped, which is a set of headings essentially, which allow you to apply those settings to create project-based learning lessons and experiences in a structured way that lets you build in the success criteria and differentiation and all of the scaffolding that you need to provide learners throughout that. And there's a module on that on the edX course on how to write PBL lessons by applying that schema to it. It's not the only solution. It's just a way that it works for me, and it works out in the real world. It's not the only. Obviously, it's not the panacea of how to do PBL, but it has all the ingredients to make a successful learning experience. But part of it is just making sure you've ticked all of those different elements, like in that slide I had with all the different elements, making sure that you're covering the theory, the link to the formal curriculum, making sure there's a relevant context, making sure there's some creativity baked into it, making sure you're keeping your students engaged, making sure you're delivering it properly. There's an awful lot of different things to think about, which can be quite challenging when developing projects. And this is why maybe why it's not adopted so widely, is because it is more challenging to plan and resource. But the impact of it it far outweighs any effort it takes to create them.
Thanks, Rob. You touched on some of the challenges that the teachers and educators face in doing project-based learning really well and with confidence. In your experience, what are some of those main challenges, and how have you seen teachers overcome those?
I can start with one of the challenges that I'm seeing is letting go. We have teachers who are afraid, like Mark mentioned about being brave. While he meant that probably for the students, but also for the teacher, letting go of that control. Because when students are engaging in project-based learning, it's not going to be nice and quiet and traditional in there. It's going to be some chaos going in there, but it's going to be good chaos once you set your expectations and your criteria of what you expect them to be doing. And again, having that clear rubric. And I remember just last week speaking to a teacher who said to me, for kindergarten students, I'm holding their hand and I don't know why I'm not letting go. And I said to her, what would happen if you actually just let go? What's the worst that would happen if you let go? And she said, I don't know. And I said, try it tomorrow and report back to me and let me know. And I think that's one of the barriers. It's us. We're scared. We don't want that administrator to come into class and see all this chaos and give us a bad evaluation. And I think another barrier could be resources. We have all these grand ideas of things we want to do, but we may not have the resources. We may teach students who don't have the resources at home either. And everyone's not a grant writer. Everyone's not good at writing grants and getting their classrooms funded. So I think just letting go and not having the resources or not creatively seeing that you can do PBL with cardboard or, you could do it with just about anything.
Thanks, Chanel. I mean, Mark, did you have anything you wanted to build on with that from your experiences?
I don't have anything to add to that particular question.
No problem. Yeah. Great. Yeah. We've had several questions come through in the before questions and in the live questions. Where can I find examples of projects for English or for middle school algebra or for computing? Have you got any thoughts on where educators should look for more ideas for specific areas?
Teach engineering is good. I think I saw PBL. Someone put it in the chat, is really good.
If you want computing ones, school.arm.com. There's a wealth of PBL projects there for you to explore. Check out the micro course book. Lots of good stuff there. And Twitter, there's loads of good stuff as well. It really depends what bit you're after. Are you after a specific idea for a lesson or a comprehensive pack of resources, or hashtag PBL? Exactly. There's an awful lot of stuff out there. It's just what format do you need it in? Do you need it just a concept so that you can write your own project, or do you need like a off the shelf ready to apply package? It depends where you are at in your PBL journey.
Thanks. Going back to the topic of differentiation, we had a question from somebody asking, have you had any experience of running or designing PBL projects for students with special needs or autism in particular?
So I do have a little bit to share on that, because I taught a computer science course for a middle school that had 35 students in the class. And one of the students was pretty far along on the spectrum, enough to have an instructional aide follow her around the entire school day. And my initial reaction was, I have no idea how to help this child, and plus I've got 34 other ones who all are demanding attention. And they were working on sort of mini projects at first. They weren't ready to do bigger projects, but for this week we're going to make this or whatever, and they would be working on their parts of it. And the instructional aide's advice was, let's just give her games on the computer to play. And I found that kind of very sad, and it violated my principle of respecting the student as an intellectual agent. But that's all I was able to do at first. Little by little, she started watching what other students were doing. By the end of the term, she was starting to do some of the things that the other students had done earlier, but she was doing them. And she was listening. All that time, we thought she was just playing games and acting out and whatever. She was actually paying some attention to what was going on. So I thought, well, that's great. At least she got something out of it. Well, here's what really amazed me. This was an elective course, and you could take it in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade, and you would be given more advanced projects if you came back. Guess who came back the next year? That same student came back, and she actually got quite capable in building projects in Scratch. This was in MIT Scratch for teaching, basic coding and so on. So sometimes it's to be patient and respect the student, and they may come along.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Mark. Sorry, much appreciated. I want to make sure that we finish on time, and there are far more questions than we could possibly answer. Please do make sure that you're connecting with the other attendees on the chat, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for such a rich array of answers to a wide spectrum of questions. Just before we finish off, I'd love to just hear from each of you the answer to the question. If you had one piece of advice to give to a teacher who was thinking of getting getting started with project-based learning, what would it be if you had one piece of advice?
I'll go. I would say trust your students and trust yourself. You'll be surprised what you can accomplish.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark.
This is going to be probably controversial, but I'll say fail. Fail. It's okay to fail. It's okay for your students to fail. It's okay for you to fail. And I always treat failure as my first attempt in learning. We're going to learn as we go along. So walk into that PBL knowing that, hey, we may fail today, and that's okay. We'll be better.
I think harking back to the beginning of my presentation, it's about being confident, be brave. You know, if you're not failing, you're not innovating. So take that leap, have a go, but also do your due diligence. Make sure that you're preparing your learners for that. Don't just try and do something super complicated straight away. You know, use your noggin. But yes, take the leap of faith. Do it. Give it a go. Even if you just do one project, and then you'll see that spark, that light bulb moment when students realize that they can do this sort of stuff and they can engage with this and they can go really far and do really innovative stuff. So yeah, bravery, confidence, and prior preparation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And I couldn't have put it better, Kate. In your words, thanks to our awesome presenters. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for such a rich and condensed sharing of your experiences, really inspiring stuff. And thank you so much for your time. You're all really busy people. A big thank you also to all of the people who've participated in this conversation, who've fueled it with your questions and with your curiosity and with your experiences. We're really looking forward to seeing you again for the next conversation in a month's time, which is going to be about using tech to support better diversity and inclusion, especially for students transitioning out of secondary school. And with that, I'm going to end the session. Please do follow, you can follow Defi on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And we really hope to see you again for another session. Thanks very much, everyone.